I'm going to read to you, translated, of course, one of the teachings of the Buddha 2,600 years ago. Now, many of you know I'm Buddhist, so it is my tendency somewhat when I'm speaking about topics, as I will today, to reach into my particular spiritual practice. It would be wonderful to hear it from a Christian or Jewish or Islamic or other practices as well, but I will share the one I'm the most comfortable with, and perhaps at other times we can speak of the equivalent in Christian and other teachings. And the issue is about, or the aspect of human nature, is what the Buddha called the three poisons. It's translated usually greed, anger, and ignorance. Although in what I'm going to read in a moment, it is greed, aversion, and delusion. So translate aversion and anger together, and then delusion and ignorance together, because they're really meaning the same thing. And this is from one of the probably later talks during his 40 years of teaching. This was said by the Blessed One, so I've heard. And you're going to hear a certain amount of repetition because this is an oral tradition. They had to remember these words for nearly 400 years until they were written down. There are these three inside poisons or stains. Inside enemies, inside foes, inside murderers, inside adversaries. Which three? Greed is an inside stain, inside enemy, inside foe. Aversion is an inside poison or stain. Delusion is an inside stain, inside enemy, inside foe, inside murderer. These are the three inside poisons, inside enemies, inside foes. Greed causes harm. Greed provokes the mind. People don't realize it as a danger born from within. A person, when greedy, doesn't know their own welfare. When greedy, doesn't see truth. Overcome with greed, they are in the dark or blind. But when one abandoning greed feels no greed, or what would merit greed, greed gets shed from them like a drop of water off a lotus leaf. Aversion, or anger, causes harm. Aversion provokes the mind. People don't realize it as a danger born from within. A person, when angry, doesn't know their own welfare. When angry, don't see truth. Overcome with anger, they're in the dark and blind. But when one, abandoning anger, feels no anger for what would merit anger, anger drops away like a palm leaf from its stem. Delusion, or ignorance, causes harm. Delusion provokes the mind. People don't realize it as a danger born from within. A person, when deluded or ignorant, doesn't know their own welfare. When deluded, they don't see truth. Overcome with delusion, they're in the dark or blind. But when someone, abandoning ignorance or delusion, feels no delusion for what would merit delusion, they disperse all delusion as the rising of the sun disperses the dark. So let's reflect for a few moments on that reading. And what is the question that I would pose to you is, what is greed, anger, and ignorance? Are they indeed the three poisons? And what is their cure? Okay, I know you've solved it. Right, you probably figured it out. But I do want to start by saying thank you to Kimberly for that wonderful testimonial. It's lovely to have you and your family here. And to Monica for your music, and also to She Sings, say that 10 times real fast. And also John for taking over from Karen. So the Jewish High Holy Day of Yom Kippur was yesterday, the Day of Atonement. Atonement has rituals in many religious faiths, and Unitarian Universalism doesn't. And I sometimes think that it's failing. Although I will say that last year, some of you may remember that I did an atonement service the Sunday after Christmas, and it involved flash paper and the letting go of the things that we needed to let go of in our lives. I will be doing the same thing again on January 1st, on the first Sunday of 2012. Now, many of you know that I spent years in training at Great Vows Zen Monastery in Oregon. On the morning services that we would do approximately 4:30 in the morning, there was something called the Gata, or verse of atonement, and we did it every day. I'll repeat it twice. I'll speak it the way we would speak it at the monastery, and then I'll just read it as words. What we would do together is about 20-25 people would be, all evil karma ever committed by me since of old, on account of my beginningless greed, anger, and ignorance, born of my body, mouth, and thought, now I atone for it all. And it would be repeated 3 times. All evil karma ever committed by me since of old, on account of my beginningless greed, anger, and ignorance, born of my body, mouth, and thought, now I atone for it all. I've always loved that verse, or Gata, because it speaks to the heart of the human condition of pain and dissatisfaction in our lives. So this morning, what I'd like to do is speak about those 3 characteristics. In Buddhism, as I said earlier, they're called the 3 poisons because they are poisonous. They are known as greed, anger, and ignorance, or greed, aversion, and delusion in this translation of the Buddha's talk. When the Buddha taught about 2,600 years ago, he said that these 3 factors were the primary factors and causes of human suffering and discontent. And he also said there was a cure. Now, if you know Buddhism well, that part of that cure is the 4 Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. But this morning, I just want to focus on these poisons and one possible cure. We see examples of those poisons all around us. Their cures are all around us as well, but we have to look closely. And I'll explore some of those ways to cure that were happened in the news. Finally, I'm going to do a guided meditation on a way to help cure these afflictions, or at least face them. There will not be any conversation time after the sermon, because I'd like us to focus on mindfulness practice within, rather than words spoken aloud without. Now, greed seems pretty easy to understand. It can refer to selfishness, misplaced desire, or grasping after things that we think absolutely are bound unequivocally to make us happy. Now, some of you know that I have a particular attachment to electronic equipment. Few things in life please me more than the latest tablet, phone, smartphone, or anything to do with modern communications. That's good to me. But when does desire take over from just enough? For example, here, thanks to the late Steve Jobs and Apple, I have an iPhone. It's really most things one could possibly want in communications. It has internet, has Facebook, has GPS. It has Portland, Oregon traffic, just in case. It has webcams from around the world. It has innumerable apps, all to make life less boring. Oh, no, yes, it has a phone. So why, I ask you, would I still have that as well as a tablet, a laptop, and 3 desktop computers? This is what is known as subtle greed, or craving. And then there's institutional greed. You've probably noticed a general hue and cry in America these days about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. The justifiable argument is that those who make more money ought to pay more in taxes for the common good. The inequity in income is rapidly transforming this country into basically the equivalent of a Gilded Age in the late 19th century. At that time, as now, rapid technological advances meant fortunes to be made by entrepreneurs who were determined, ruthless, and quick to take note of human desires, aka. So what are we supposed to do about institutional greediness? Well, one approach is by public demonstration of frustration. We see such expression with the Occupy Wall Street protest that is now, I'm happy to see, spreading by internet and social networking to other cities, including a event here in Clemson on Thursday at noon, I believe, at the university. That's one way. We can respond also to greed by voting out one set of greedy politicians for another set of politicians who insist that they are not greedy. However, if Buddhist teachings are correct, we got to start someplace, because election day doesn't come every day. So in Buddhism, the process to cure greed and craving starts within ourselves. Such teachings focus on the inner development of the individual, each one of us here. So let's imagine we know somebody who craves something that they are absolutely sure will make them happy, if they get it. It could be a new relationship, or a new job, or a physical possession. So what are we supposed to respond if this person is getting so excited that they just know, just out of their reach lies happiness? Well, one obvious answer is to ask them if they know that that new relationship, job, or possession will make them happy. Will that possession be enough, or will it lead to another possession that will lead in turn to still more unhappiness? When will we know enough is enough? A second approach is generosity. All the world's religions codify generous giving as part of their mission. Islam, for example, has generosity as its third pillar of the 5 pillars. It has an annual alms donation for the needy. Judaism traditionally calls for a 10% donation to charity. Christian communities have varying amounts, but all support the idea of generosity as part of the mission and teachings and ministry of Jesus to this day. Now, Unitarian Universalist congregations do not demand a specific amount of tithing or mandated giving. Every congregation I have been to, including this one, has been generous with time, talents, and funds to the larger community. That's part of who you are. Next Sunday, you're going to have the special honor of having the executive director of the UU, Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, here with you to speak on excellence in ministry. Don, this Sunday, is in both Texas and Colorado, quite a trick, doing Association Sunday services in both states. But he will be here next Sunday, and I had invited him here last spring, hoping that he would be able to give you some insights and perspective on excellence in ministry. because this is a vital topic for you now. He'll also speak about Association Sunday, which is actually today. And I hope that Sunday, next week, you'll find generosity unfolding for this larger association of which we're a part, over 1,000 churches in North America, the community, the work that's done in Boston, in our districts, to really support this congregation, as has happened many times in the past. So I hope you will give them your support. So, what about anger or aversion? We all know that pretty well. We all get angry. It's an important part of being human. Anger can propel us into changing a bad situation. I was in a somewhat similar situation a year ago now about a relationship, and I had to finally get angry in order to let go of it and to start determining my own course in my life. That was hard to do, but anger channeled into a positive direction forced me out of my comfort zone of denial. But also anger can be reactive and cause us to make terrible decisions we later regret. So how are we to examine anger or its darker cousin, hatred? You probably noticed this week the story in Italy when the murder conviction of Amanda Knox was overturned. She returned home to Seattle shortly thereafter. Now, when you think about it, what happened that tragic night will never be known. The whole truth, nothing but the truth. Because I've mentioned several times here, there's only partial truth. We'll never know what really happened that night when somebody lost their life. But whatever did happen, people lost control of their emotions. At some point, anger must have fed the emotional states of everybody involved, leading to death. That is anger run amok. We see lesser forms of it with road rage or on talk shows. It's everywhere. And it waits inside every one of us, hoping to be born. Now compare the Amanda Knox story to this news story on Yahoo, bless you, on Yahoo this week. There was a woman by the name of Tricia Waldron who was 28 years old, and she realized her life was at a dead end. She had gone from being a daughter to a wife to having a child at 22. She was now single, living on food stamps, barely, in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which, by the way, are one of the poorest areas of the United States. She happened to be at her daughter's school one day and heard the words about, "You have to reclaim your life." And so she did. She started a small jewelry business, and it expanded over the years with a few bumps along the way. But she said later she almost failed. But there was one reason that she succeeded, and the business grew exponentially. She said, "At first, I had a super aggressive, take no prisoners approach. I might have gained something for myself, but I wasn't very nice to those people around me, including all my friends, all my business associates, my clients, pretty much everyone. Eventually, I learned that you draw power as a woman in business by being compassionate and inclusive. This way, you can make long and loyal relationships." By the way, she's now remarried, living in California, and a millionaire. But here is a person who transformed anger as aggression into compassion and partnership and collaboration, just as you're doing here. Here's one more example of transforming anger into compassionate action. I mentioned the Occupy Wall Street protests earlier. Those protests are spreading to other cities in the United States, and they're following classic patterns of nonviolence. There have been isolated incidents, as there tend to be, but generally they've turned from potential of violence into bearing witness with peacefulness and demonstrations rather than violence and fisticuffs. They follow the pioneering steps of Gandhi, King, and so many in Eastern Europe in 1989 and in the Arab world this year. Finally, there's ignorance or delusion. Now, delusion in Buddhist philosophy means that we don't understand reality. We don't have a clear picture of what it is. We don't experience and understand and accept things exactly as they are because we put filters on them of like, dislike, want, don't want, love, hate. We do not understand the true interdependence of all things, our seventh principle. Because we're all in this room together, for example, we're all sharing the same air, the same germs, the same heartbeats. None of us own it. We're all in it together. But what happens is we tend to grab or cling to things that we think are going to make us happy. Now, ownership of property is one example. Some of you know that I enjoy antiques, Asian antiques. I have a few pieces at home, but do I really own them? They were created anywhere between 300 and 100 years ago. They are now called antiques, and someday they'll break, and they'll lose their assumed value. They're not mine to own. And on occasion in the past, if somebody has come to my house wherever I've lived and said, wow, I love that, whatever it is, I'll say, here, have it. And then it passes on. That's where ownership becomes really having borrowed something. So that's one way. Delusion ties into the other two poisons. We think that the next relationship or job or perfect home or better car will make us happy. We become angry if we don't get what we want, and then we try all the harder or become aggressive, as Tricia Waldron did in her business. And then the cycle continues to burn us over and over. We become poisoned. What the Buddha and the lineage of women and men who were teachers down to this very day said that the source of the three poisons was fear. It isn't the ultimate source. The ultimate source in Buddhist teaching is inherent wholeness. It's like our first principle that says the inherent worth and dignity of every person. If you take it even deeper, it's the inherent wholeness, inherent wisdom, inherent compassion, inherent love. We all have it. None are missing it. But we bury it under layers of garbage and baggage in our lives. Among those are the three poisons. But the major one is fear. So imagine how fear could create a horrible tragedy for Amanda Knox and all those affected by those events that night. Imagine how fear could make Tricia Waldron so aggressive in her business pursuits that nobody really wanted to have anything to do with her. Imagine how fear permeates our lives today as the economy of the world verges on ruin and political paralysis continues at all levels of government. Imagine wondering if you, when you leave Clemson, or you're looking next in another state, if you're going to get another job, or are you going to be comfortable in retirement? Are you even going to be able to retire? What fear can do is paralyze you into inaction, or even worse, into a reactive response that is negative and angry and hurtful to yourself and others. One last story from the week's news. As you know, Steve Jobs died on Wednesday. His commencement speech to Stanford University has been widely quoted in social and other media. Here are some words that absolutely struck me in the end of his speech. He said this: "Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your inner voice. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. Your heart and intuition somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. Those words about courage to follow the heart and intuition are the antidote to fear, I think. Such a willingness to step back and truly hear what our intuitive voice, our voice of wisdom and compassion, asks us, begs us to do, is the core of meditation and the deepening of wisdom. Now, I said at the beginning I'd offer up a closing meditation practice. My Zen teachers at Great Vow Zen Monastery have taught a practice for many years called voice dialogue. Anybody heard of that? Okay. The premise is that, and this may sound strange, that we all have voices in our heads. Now, that doesn't mean that we're crazy. What it means is that all the time we've got stuff, voices, our voices in our heads with our sort of different types of our personality. So there can be the part of me that is a Zen student and saying, Alex, meditate, meditate, quiet, quiet, quiet. There's another part of me thinking, okay, what am I going to do for supper tonight? There's another part of me thinking, where am I going to be next year? Yeah, stuff like that. And we have these voices that are going on in our heads all the time. It's one of the things that really prevents us from being restful. So these voices for you today could be, what's for lunch? Or it could be, when's the sermon going to be over? Or it could be, what am I going to do tomorrow at work? And so on. Now, one of the strongest personality voices in our minds here in the West, in the Western world, is called the internal critic. Does anybody know that voice? Oh, some of you do. Good. Good. Many women for generations have heard it say, you are not worthy, or you should be submissive. Men have heard it as the voice saying, you failed. You don't do work very well. You're a bad example to your boss, to your family, to your friends, to everyone. I'm told that the internal critic is an old voice, an old part of our personality that's trying to push us into living life differently, but it tends to speak from a place of fear. That fear then translates into a grasping. Money, possessions, narcissistic demands. It can cause anger or convince us that its voice, its critical voice, its voice of criticism, is the most powerful voice we have. It isn't. Voice dialogue training says that there's always an opposite voice for each of these characteristics in our minds. So the opposite of the internal critic is usually called the wise teacher or the aware ego. It's the adult and compassionate one of every one of us. It's basically wisdom, and we all have it. So what I'd like to invite you to do is sit comfortably for a few minutes. Close your eyes. And see if you can bring forth the inner critic. Think of some miserable failure you've had recently, or something that you've really, to be blunt, screwed up. Or something where someone has come to you and in the most gentle, kind way said, boy, that was really blankety blank, wasn't it? Or maybe a relative or a spouse or a companion or a parent or a child had something rather unkind to say to you, putting you down. What the inner critic will do is repeat that to you over and over and over. So try to remember the last time that your inner critic spoke to you. See how it feels. See if your inner critic can be summoned. See if you can give it a name. The one that I have is usually named after my foster parents, either my foster mother or foster father. So I usually name my inner critic one of them. Imagine that the inner critic voice has a shape or a body. It can be any body you want it to be. And now what I'd like you to do is imagine it sitting in front of you. You're both sitting in chairs. But you are the wise teacher. You are the voice of wisdom and compassion. You are like a parent giving the deepest loving kindness you can to a child or someone who is in pain, someone who's confused or unskillful. Invite your inner critic, if you have it present, to sit with you. And if you can't summon it now, just remember the process of this meditation and try it the next time it comes to you, because it will. Imagine your inner critic sitting with you and you looking at its shape or face or body or saying its name, and say to it, please share with me your worries, your fears, your concerns. For now, you only have 2 minutes, and then it will be time for you to rest. Try to bring in your mind this particular aspect of who you are, the internal critic. Sit with it. Listen politely. Don't interrupt. You may discover it starts saying the same thing over and over again. I will ring the bell in a couple of minutes. When I ring the bell, tell that aspect, that inner critic that you own, that believes it owns you, thank you for speaking, and now it is time that you rest. When I ring the bell, take a moment and see how you feel. Do you feel powerless, or do you feel empowered? Do you feel fearful, or do you feel wise and kinder? I'll ring the bell in a couple of minutes.